Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I pastor Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. Our church is a part of the Disciples of Christ denomination. Not something that I mention every single time that I talk here, but I think that you should know. I'm proud to be a part of a denomination that emphasizes inclusion and unity. And if you should be interested in checking out us or learn more about our overall movement, please check out our website. You can visit our specific website at www.indyncc.org, INDYNCC.org, or you can read about the overall denomination at disciples.org. Either way, on our website, indyncc.org, you'll be able to find my contact information as well as details about our church, service times, and other ministries of Northwood. And this podcast, by the way, is a ministry of Northwood, but we could not do it without the All Indiana Podcast Network, which is putting things mildly, that we could not do it without them because they produce and distribute podcasts made by not only us, but Hoosiers across all streaming platforms, or at least the ones that I've heard of. So if you're interested in learning more, please visit www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's www.wishtv.com/podcasts. We're going to move right along to the episode, but before we do, I encourage you to like, subscribe, or follow us by way of whatever app you are using to listen now. Just pause it and do that if you haven't already. Here in a moment, we're going to be going over a passage from the Bible, specifically from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. But before we do that, we need to take a break for some ads for our podcast listeners. So I'll catch you all after these ads. And we're back. And as I was saying, today we'll be reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. And I'll not delay. I'll just read it, bearing in mind that this is a rather longer reading. So sympathy if you nod off in the middle, but buckle up, here goes. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a crowd had gathered around him. A great crowd had gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came and, when he saw him, fell at his feet and pleaded with him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his cloak, I will be made well." Immediately, her flow of blood stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my cloak?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the synagogue leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the synagogue leader, "Do not be afraid, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the synagogue leader's house, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in there where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk. She was about 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. And that's the end of those two stories intertwined. And if you were thinking that one of those stories sounded familiar, there's a reason for it. I'll not flatter myself into believing that any of my sermons or podcast episodes are so memorable that you are liable to remember something I spoke about months ago, or at least in very specific detail. But if one of those stories was sounding familiar, you're thinking to yourself, a bit of deja vu, maybe heard this more recently, well, you should feel that way. Back in February, we considered the story that's smack dab in the middle of this text. It's almost a story in sandwich style. You've got him starting out to go heal Jairus' daughter, then what happens with the woman with the hemorrhage of blood in the middle, and then the end where he heals Jairus' daughter. But the story with the woman with the issue of blood, I can't exactly remember why I elected to speak on that story months ago when it wasn't in the lectionary text, but when I came across today's lectionary text, I had a choice to make. For you see, when we considered this woman's plight 8 months ago, I had excised her story from the middle of this larger story, as I keep saying. Her story sandwiched between the longer narrative that we just read in total. And when you step back and take a bird's eye view of the text, we see that the story of these two daughters, is told together for a reason. Those two daughters being Jairus' daughter and the nameless woman suffering from 12 years of perpetual bleeding. Someone else's daughter too. To make this point, I'll ask you to consider a probably more well-known story, one where we maybe focus on one character to the neglect of another that we're meant to also notice, the story of the prodigal son, told in the Gospel of Luke chapter 15. And in that story, Jesus tells of a son who asks for his inheritance early from his father, before his father had passed away. He then receives the inheritance, squanders it, and then after a time comes back home where he expects to be received with some amount of anger and consternation, but instead is gladly received by his father, who had never stopped loving his son despite his errant ways. The point, the same is true of us when we wander in various ways from the truth, life, or love. We may find our way back, and when we do, God welcomes us back gladly. But that story is about two sons. It's often forgotten that the story of the prodigal son is really about two brothers. The son who remained, the anti-prodigal, if you will, displayed an attitude toward his father's grace that we are meant to notice, and that it is out of sync with the love of the Father, which mirrors the love of God. We are meant to compare the two sons to see the contrasts. One son left and then returned. In returning, he better understood the love of his father after having lived a wayward life. The other son, the one who stayed, who maybe feels he deserves more, became confused and offended at the love of a parent that never gives up on a child who may not deserve second chances, we think. So that's the way that story functions, with two characters to hold into contrast. And similarly, we are meant to compare and contrast Jesus' response to these two daughters. One, a nameless woman, ostracized because of her physical ailment. For a woman who bled as she had bled, was considered unclean and untouchable by her community. But then you have this other daughter born into a house with a name. Jairus' name is recorded for posterity. Is right there in the text. We know him. We don't know his daughter's name, but we know at least his name, because he was a leader at the synagogue. There would have been people in the community who first read Mark's gospel decades later who may well have remembered this public figure. So consequently, you can assume, or I think we can surmise from the story, I think the point we're to take away when comparing these two daughters, one of the points is that this daughter has opportunities and privileges that our poor woman with the issue of blood could but hope for. Jairus was the sort of guy, for instance, who could approach Jesus in a public way. In the story we read, he beseeched him to attend to his daughter in front of everyone. Jairus' daughter's situation was such that the whole community, in turn, seems to be in on the action. It's a public interest story. The daughter of a public figure, sick or near dying. Big news in a small community. In the woman who was bleeding, however, well, her situation gathers little attention. She has to sneak in through the crowd, so little attention that she can slip through the crowd surreptitiously and inconspicuously touch the hem of Jesus' cloak. We don't know her name, the name of anyone in her family. Now, when Jairus' entreaty was made in public, hers, well, he knew that he could make a house call, ask Jesus rather to make a house call. But the woman's entreaty was so private that it wasn't even spoken in words. She contrived a mere touch, at which Jesus responded, "Who touched me?" Jairus, in contrast, was able to address Jesus publicly, albeit with no small amount of obeisance. He literally did fall down before Jesus and pleaded, but he at least had a voice. From what we know about this man and his likely role in the community, as a leader of his local synagogue, he was most certainly someone with a voice that was often heard. Meaning he was someone who could name his desires in public, even his desperate desires, even whilst pleading, but with an expectation that others would listen. It's a fairly common dynamic, repeated again and again, even today. There are those whose lives and stories that we notice, and others who we don't. When a child goes missing, for instance, or is injured, who is from an affluent home or whose parent is some known public figure, you might hear about their story on the nightly news. You might hear about it for months if it is not resolved quickly. Even if it is states away, you might see a news report. My whole life I've seen these sorts of things. But if the missing or injured child is from a poor home, or worse, is homeless, and if the parent is as nameless as their nameless child, then, well, who will notice? We notice some people, and we fail to notice or overtly ignore many others. This is the reality we have come to accept. The question for the reader, hearer of these stories today is, which of these two daughters did Jesus notice? Which of these did he heal? If one or both of these two daughters were lost or hurt, which do you think Jesus would try to help? Rhetorical questions, all of these. He noticed and healed them both. Faith in Jesus healed them both, and Jesus' faith and undying love for them and in them. Notice the story ends in the same place for both of these daughters, healed and restored to their communities. But these two daughters couldn't have started from different leaping off points. And this is why their stories were presented side by side. There are several allusions to this throughout the text, that these stories are meant to be read together. I mean, for one, they're literally woven together. But perhaps the most obvious example of, or tip off to that these are meant to be compared, are found in verses 25 and 42 respectively. And I'll just read them now, one after the other. Verse 25 from chapter 5. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. And now verse 42. And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. Did you catch it? The girl is 12. The exact number of years the woman had been bleeding. Their lives, when compared in parallel, reveal striking contrasts. Jairus' daughter, living 12 years of presumed health, while our poor woman had spent those 12 years ostracized and desperately seeking a cure. Verse 26 says that she had spent all the money she had on physicians, grifters, and conmen likely, just the same as today. People selling us various forms of wellness for a price. And these had only made her situation worse. Contrast this with the life of Jairus' daughter, who, because of her father's position in her community, had access to health and resources the poor women did not. The woman who bled had long endured her struggle. Jairus' young daughter had only recently fallen ill. And this is a crisis moment for Jairus in his privilege. But the woman who had bled had run a marathon of suffering. This is no crisis. This is the long haul. Jairus and his daughter have perhaps only just entered into the race that the woman has been running for who knows how long, at least 12 years. And yet, the faith of the woman in the good news of Jesus and the faith of Jairus in the face of his laughing neighbors brought these two daughters together to the same place, to healing, wholeness, and to restoration in their respective communities, which we are now seeing are the same community. And if things go as Jesus intends, these two daughters will think of themselves as sisters going forward, don't you know? Jairus may well come to know this woman whose story is now interwoven with his daughters from then until this present day. As people told the stories over decades, I'm sure that Jairus and his daughter became curious about this other woman, and perhaps they came to know one another. And the rest must be speculation, but we can imagine the Jairus in the story seeking out the woman after later in the day wondering about this individual who, like his daughter, had also been given life by Jesus. You can imagine as the sun sets him finding or asking others, what's her name? And perhaps he invited her over for a meal to share, just as they had seen Jesus break bread so many times with so many different kinds of people. Now, the woman had spent all of her money in pursuit of health. Well, perhaps Jairus would be her benefactor going forward. Who knows? And these are all logical next steps in line with the impetus of the gospel that calls us to love and generosity. But one thing is for sure. When we enter into the realm of God, whether we be young or old, rich or poor, affluent or of no repute, we enter into it as God's children, equally loved, equally valued, and equally worthwhile, along with everyone else. As I said before, these two daughters, should they stick around and join the church after Jesus leaves, will find themselves to be a part of that egalitarian community described in the book of Acts. Jairus may well give away his possessions someday so that people like the bleeding woman may have all that they need to live well in their community. In fact, we read about people like Jairus doing similar things in the earliest accounts of the church. People in the old realm coming from positions of privilege and wealth and status, but realizing those things don't count for the same things in the realm of God and giving those to the good of the community. Whatever the case, Jesus knows that they by now have discovered that these two daughters of God are sisters and are equally esteemed in the place where God wants to take us. So now it is for us to take a step back and take another bird's eye view of our situation. Just as we had to take a step back to see these two daughters' stories in conjunction with one another to really see them both. We can step back and look at all of humanity in all of its diverse calamity and splendor. Who are the daughters and sons of God? Well, Sunday school question with an easy answer. We all are. Those without names and those who have names are all known by God, and God knows all of their names and yours. Today's story is about two daughters of equal worth. Now I address an audience of daughters and sons and everyone in between. At church, we're discovering what Jesus taught us that day so long ago when he brought a dead girl to life and healed another. We're discovering alongside one another what Jesus knew to be true. There is no male or female, rich, poor, slave, or free in the body of Christ, which is evidenced at our church in many ways. I'm speaking now specifically of my church that I pastor, Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana, 4550 Central Avenue. For instance, in our leadership structure at Northwood, we have both young and old, and rich and poor. I'll not say slave and free in the sense written about in the Bible, as it was literally speaking about the owning of other humans, but there are many in our churches who are trapped in any number of ruts, struggles, addictions, or anxieties. Many of us are, figuratively speaking, slaves to these things in the sense that they own and direct our decisions in life, or they can. But in the church, this matters less and less, and we are elevated to positions of meaning despite our imperfections. We grow together, rich and poor, struggling and stable alike. I think that a lot of the fun with this story today is in the imagining of what life was like after these miracles. As I said before, just imagining that was what made my mind go to interesting places. Did the woman take on Jairus' daughter as a sort of goddaughter? Or did these people relate after these events occurred? We'll never know. But near and all around us, we have a living example of this story playing out in real time in our own lives. We've come to our churches together to find healing and restoration in Jesus Christ, and we found it together. Our story is like the stories we consider today, except spread out over lifetimes, generationally. But I hope you'll notice along the way that Jesus is calling us each out of scripted roles in our society, those roles that our society will give us, and into much more important designations, or more specifically, one more important designation, child of God. For this is who you really are, and so is everyone else you meet. So treat them this way, and you will discover that they have a name and a story just like you. Our faith in God, Jesus, and in one another is making us, well, even now, making us into the community that Jesus envisions and calls these two daughters to and calls us to today. So I'll leave you with these two things to think about. One, perhaps you struggle to see all persons as God's children. Perhaps your culture's ideas about place, celebrity status, and power have so corrupted your vision that there are many children of God who you fail to see. Others, like our woman in today's story, struggling through the crowd and anonymity. I think that I'm describing all of us right now, but let's have some humility here. I think that we all sometimes struggle to love everyone as we should, or see everyone especially as we should. Well, here is an invitation to open up our eyes to see them as God sees them. But perhaps this is not your primary struggle. Perhaps you are like the woman, unnoticed, no big-name father like Jairus to advocate for you. Perhaps yours is not so much a struggle to see as a struggle to be seen. If this describes you, I want you to hear what Jesus told the woman he had healed. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And if your disease, is a sense of hopelessness and a lack of self-worth, then be healed. Your healing comes with an understanding of your true identity, child of God. Your healing comes as your faith in our divine parent increases, faith to see us through and to hold us safe and fast. So daughters and sons, or whoever you say that you are, go in peace and be healed. Know your worth and join in with the others who have found the same. Child of God, daughter or son, remember, this is who you are.